Great. Good morning. Good morning. Welcome to our third installment of Beyond the Gift Card Community Conversation Series, where we are working to bridge the gap between communities and research. So we're going to go ahead and get started because we don't have long and the hour tends to go by very quickly. My name is Ede Taylor-Crittle, and I'm the Executive Director of Healthy Communities Coalition. I'm thrilled to be joined by our guest, and also by our featured guest, and also very thrilled to be working with a graduate student from Northwestern University. So I'm happy to introduce Gerpha Gerlin, and Gerpha will moderate most of the session. So I'm going to turn the reins over to Gerpha. Thank you, Gerpha.
Thank you so much, Edie, and thank you everyone for joining us today. So I just wanted to do another check. Everyone can hear me okay? And everyone can see my screen, correct?
Correct.
Okay. So today we are joined by Dr. Rebecca Johnson, who is a freelance researcher specializing in research partnership and facilitation. She's held several positions, including at Northwestern as well. And she also works with the faith-based organization Pastors for Peace Corps with Dr. Paris Davis. Dr. Crystal Jackson is a senior research scientist at the global nonprofit Education Development Center. That's the name of the nonprofit. And she is also the founder of her own organization, Good Human. And so if she's able to join us, I'm sure that she'll be able to speak more as to what that particular organization looks like. Okay. So we'll go ahead and get started. So I first wanted to go ahead and give a little context as to what Healthy Communities Coalition, or HCC, does. So Healthy Communities Coalition is a grassroots organization that is dedicated to helping minoritized communities leverage research as a tool, right? And so one of the other kind of colleague institutions that does community-based research, Chicago Beyond, has this guide that I always like to reference that is called Why Am I Always Being Researched, right? And some people may be familiar with it, right? And so what I really appreciate that Edie is doing with HCC is trying to make it so that minoritized community voices are elevated in the research process, which historically they have not been, right? We're very used to thinking about minoritized individuals, underserved communities being research subjects. But what HCC is trying to do through capacity building is have them be research partners and research leaders in their own right, okay? So just giving a little bit of context as to the vision and mission statement of HCC. Now I want to go ahead and give a quick kind of plug for an ongoing profile that's going on with HCC. Project Erase is still open, and we have about 48 respondents to date who've completed this assessment, with several of them being community partners. And this is again to the end of trying to get a sense of how community-based and faith-based organizations are currently understanding and using research in their respective organizations, right, in their respective programming. And so if you scan this QR code, it should take you to that profile. It's also linked on our website, and I'll have another QR code toward the end of the presentation that's a little bit bigger for you to scan as well, okay? And then the last kind of contextualizing piece that I'll add to this before we get into the kind of true content delivery of today's session is the pillars that drive the research and really that drive these conversation series, right? And so we've organized each monthly themed conversation around these pillars. We've already talked about research and program design. We've talked about research and evaluation, right, which is what we're doing today. And then future sessions, we'll talk about things like data collection and how that data is used, how results are disseminated and analyzed, as well as community-driven research, where we'll talk a little bit more about community-based participatory research, okay? So all of this is just context kind of foregrounding the conversation that we'll have today and the future conversations to come. And if anyone has any questions about conversations that we've had previously in March and April, feel free to ask, right, to kind of help bring everything together and connect the dots, okay? Edie, is there anything you'd like to add at this point? Okay, let's continue. And let me just moderate the chat one moment. I see we have some things in the chat. Okay, so another welcome. And to anyone who might have joined us later or who may join us in the near future, this is being recorded so that we have this as an artifact that we can share out with folks. Okay. So I thought we would start off with a quick kind of conversation starter. Some people might be familiar with this as an icebreaker, but we're a small enough group, and I'm hoping people feel comfortable enough to unmute themselves. And I am wondering if we might think about the following question. How might community and faith-based organizations use research or evaluation to support their mission and services? How might this be useful to them? So we'll take about 2 or 3 minutes maybe to kind of discuss this, maybe take a few more seconds to kind of think about a response. And I'm hoping folks are comfortable enough to unmute and kind of share their input. So how might community and faith-based organizations use research evaluation to support their organizational mission and their services?
And if I may add, we can also think about this. How are you currently using research? Like, how do you currently evaluate your programs and services? What types of activities, what types of instruments are you using? You can think about it that way as well. Because this question, actually, Gerpha and I went back and forth on, because when I think about it, I think about how we evaluate. I'm not thinking about research. I'm thinking, okay, I want to know if the students who are in my program, if they've changed their attitudes, if they changed their behaviors. And we've evaluated that in past programming through pre and post surveys. So that's one way. But I never understood that I was actually using research, that I was conducting our own research for the organization, and the data we collected, we used to further that program, to either change our approach and our strategies, or to validate it. So that's one instance.
Welcome, Dr. Jackson.
Hi, Dr. Jackson. How are you?
Good morning. How are you?
Fine. Thank you so much for joining us. You have perfect timing. We just started the conversation, so we'll actually default to you. Oh, perfect. We have a response here as well.
Okay, so let me go ahead and open in the chat. So please correct me if I mispronounce your name, Muja McCaskill. So Muja McCaskill says in the chat, we do. We use surveys at the beginning of the sessions and then another one, so a pre and post, to see the level or retention of the materials that are taught once the session ends. Okay. Yes, close enough. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, thank you. So Dr. Jackson, we're just starting off with a conversation starter. I've already introduced you as the Senior Research Scientist at the Nonprofit Education Development Center and the founder of Good Human. And we've kind of gone through a little bit of context as far as what guides these community conversation series. And so we're spending maybe another minute or so thinking about this conversation starter before we continue into the content delivery. So Dr. Jackson and Dr. Johnson, please feel free to add any insight you might want to at this point before we move into the presentation.
So if I might just say, so I think Edie put her finger right on it, is that for me, it's all about evaluation. In fact, evaluation focuses on pragmatics. It focuses on assessing the effectiveness of maybe a program or learning. I think sometimes that is not the same as how research operates, which sort of is often to describe or generate new knowledge. But for me, it's not research unless it includes evaluation. So I think there's sometimes a tension there. And I think for me, it works if it's practical, it's sets to improve, it's the questions originating with the stakeholders, not necessarily a research institution. So it's about quality. The emphasis is on the value in the word evaluation. Yeah, and finding out what matters to people who've taken the programs.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. Okay.
Yeah, I agree with Dr. Johnson's perspective. And, you know, I think it's sometimes there's a blurry line between what research is and what evaluation is, because not because they are different activities, which they are, and they require kind of different approaches. But I think sometimes the blurry line is they tend to get you to kind of like the same propositions, the same kind of, they yield similar results, and that you're able to give information to a variety of different stakeholders or community members to whom your organization might be beholden, or to communities who you are seeking to be in dialogue with. I think having been an evaluator for quite some time now, more than 20 years, and then also having the opportunity to do some research years ago when I was in the professoriate, I tend to think that evaluation, and this is my bias here coming out, so I'm going to acknowledge that, that there's a practical lens that gets applied to evaluation that might be somewhat different than research, and that when you have an evaluation, and I really appreciate our fellow community members sharing that they do some kind of pre and post measure, because it really helps us to see, okay, what does this landscape look like before we had an intervention, and what does it look like now? And so there's really an opportunity to kind of have an engaged kind of learning that's on the other side of an evaluation, which I think is important. And then just one other footnote, I think it's also interesting with evaluation, because I always say anyone can be an evaluator. There was a animated cartoon my nephew was once fond of called Ratatouille, and one of the things was the lines that the chef had in that movie was, anyone can be a cook, or something like that. Anyone can be an evaluator, because we all ask questions, and we all use different methods to answer those questions. I think the only difference between the things that we do in everyday life and formal evaluation is how systematized our approach is. So it's really just taking what we already do and putting it in a systematized approach.
Thank you, Dr. Jackson. So this has already proven to be quite generative, and I'm sure that will continue as we move the conversation along. So again, we're a small enough group, and I thought we would continue in the vein of thinking about the conversation starter, thinking about the terms research and evaluation. But I want to kind of get a sense of what people think about research itself before we think about evaluation as its own, to what Dr. Jackson was talking about, separate process, right? So what is research? What does that mean? What does that term mean, right?
And Gerpha, I think we can move on to the next slide, just for the sake of time.
Yes, I was going to. I was just giving people
Recording in progress.
Oh, okay, now it's doing that, sorry.
Okay. So I was just giving folks a chance to kind of reflect before I shared kind of my general definition. And I
Okay.
want to keep it pretty, when I say general, I mean general. Because in the same way that Dr. Jackson was talking about that line from Ratatouille, anybody can be a cook, right? Anybody really can do research. We all do research in various aspects of our lives, right? Research, all that really boils down to, for me as a public health student, is really just a systematized or systematic way of answering a question about something you notice, like an observation of a particular phenomenon, something that you notice in the world, or an idea or a thought that you have. So maybe a very baseline example of this is, let's say you're in a conversation with someone and someone uses a word that you're not familiar with, or they're referencing maybe an organization that you're not familiar with, and you whip out one of these, right, as one of your tools, right? And you go to Google or search engine, right? That in and of itself is a very informal way of conducting some type of research. It's an investigation. It's a way of answering a question, right? And there are several questions that are associated with research when it comes to the who, when, what, why, and where. So last month, I won't get too deep into this, but last month we talked about different kinds of research and research design. And so to the right in the second-hand column, I've given some examples, kind of broad buckets of what research looks like. Welcome, Sherry. We just recently started the conversation, so you haven't missed too much. So we think about qualitative research, quantitative research, and mixed methods approaches. Dr. Johnson, Dr. Jackson, any insight you'd like to add when it comes to thinking about research?
I like what you say about we all do research. I believe that passionately. I think that, you know, when we're trying to make decisions about whether to buy a car or there's so many ways in which we're doing research on a daily basis. And as you say, we may be using a phone, we may actually be doing a lot of investigation to understand something further. So yeah, I totally agree with you that it's an everyday activity. It's not this ivory tower type of activity. I appreciate
Absolutely. Yeah. And I love that visual of the ivory tower that I think sometimes people fear because it makes it seem like research is out of their hands and it's something they don't have access to, right? That only a certain privileged few have access to, which doesn't serve the general community, because when you think about research as a way of promoting generalizable knowledge, it is really supposed to be for the public, right? In terms of for the public good. Absolutely.
Absolutely. Can I add, especially from a community partner's perspective, that community-based organizations and faith-based organizations who are operating programs, ministries, or services, that we are conducting research. And that's really the big part of why we are offering these conversations, so that we understand that what we're doing, we're already defining our research, we're conducting it, and we want to look at how can we broaden this perspective, how can we think about maximizing the role of research in our work, including connecting to our researcher friends and to the universities. It's funny, Dr. Jackson said earlier, she talked about interventions, and I want to just make this distinction about the language. So in the research world, they use the term intervention, and it's not always used in the community on the ground at the grassroots level. So when we hear the term intervention, just always think program, service, or ministry. And I wanted to add that. And back to you, Gerpha.
Okay. Thank you so much for that, Ede. Language is something that is nuanced, and I think it is important to think about the language that we bring from all the different contexts that we work in, right? We wear multiple hats, right? So kind of managing that register, I think, is important. Okay, so let's go ahead and move along. I am going to try to keep us within the hour time frame because I know that we have multiple commitments and I want to honor the time that we're sharing here today. So now here I've provided this graphic. This is from somebody who actually specializes in nonprofit work organization. And so this is a graphic that I really like because I think it helps really in a simple way streamline the relationship between evaluation, outcome, and impact. And I think the latter category of impact is something that we can spend a lot of time thinking about here today, because all of us in our respective work want to make sure that we're having the impact that we intend to, right? But how do we figure that out? How do we know that our programs, our services, the interventions that we're developing, right, are doing what it is that we want them to do? And so I'll just stop here and see if perhaps Dr. Jackson might have some insight that she'd like to share here as well, because in the beginning, she talked a lot about evaluation being its own separate process and her years of working as an evaluator.
Oh, wow. This is a great visual. So thanks so much for offering this. Yeah, I tend to agree that this is a the framework is important, right? And I would even say that there's some subcomponents to this in terms of like really sussing out what the evaluation process looks like. I have a graphic that I like to use that talks about the life cycle of evaluation that has about 6 or 7 steps before we get to outcomes and impacts, outcomes and impact. But yeah, this is what we're striving for with any evaluation, right? We want to be able to talk about what changed, right? So what's the outcome based upon some anticipated, based upon the results of planned activities, right? So to give an example, we could say that we want to evaluate whether a community approach to supporting women getting employed was effective. So an outcome of that would be that more women are employed who finished a particular intervention. But I would also say that there are things that come before that. So you have short-term outcomes, you have kind of midterm outcomes, and you have longer-term outcomes. And I think those longer-term outcomes are more aligned with what this graphic has in terms of impacts, what the impact of the work actually is. But those short-term outcomes are also wins. And so I think it's sometimes important to think about how we define those things. So a short-term outcome might be different from that long-term outcome about, well, we placed 80% of the women who finished this program are now gainfully employed. But a short-term outcome of that particular goal, we want women in this particular community to be gainfully employed in livable wage jobs. A short-term outcome of that is we recruited, 70 women to be involved in this program, right? It's a way of tracking what our progress means in very tangible ways. And then a midterm outcome might be, and this is just for illustrative purposes, of those 70 women that we included, 65 of them were retained, right? And then the longer term outcome would be of those that were retained, 80% of them were able to get a job. And so what we're able to do with kind of like starting with an evaluation question, how effective was this intervention for women who are seeking employment? What were the incremental steps that we could take to help us measure our success, right? So those are the outcomes that we could talk about, right? The ways that we frame outcomes, kind of thinking about them, not from like eating the whole pie, but first we're going to eat one slice, and then you, like me, you want to go back for seconds or even thirds, right? And so really trying to make sure that we are counting all the victories, all the wins that we have, when we have them. But also, when you think about outcomes from kind of like this multi-dimensional lens, it also gives us the opportunity to course correct in the event that it wasn't what we anticipated, right? So maybe there was, if that short-term outcome that we predicted was that 80% of the women were going to be, we were going to recruit 70 women into this program, and we only recruited 35. There's a question there that goes into how we understand what the recruitment process was. How did we do our outreach? Does the program resonate with people's current needs? Maybe the program is in the morning and people have to work in the morning and they only have evening hours available. So evaluation, I always like to say, is dynamic. It gives us the opportunity to go back and recreate or go back and address what could be some areas of quality improvement, if you will. But then once we get kind of beyond those lessons learned and where we are and kind of understanding what our anticipated outcomes were, we can start talking about, once the program ends, here's what our impact was in this community. And I always say impact is not only what your direct data say, right? Well, we got 80% of these women were employed. That's great, right? That's definitely an impact. But your impact should also be something about, how do you put that in context? So if we were saying we were looking in the community of Auburn Gresham, right? And we said, well, in Auburn Gresham, Black women have an unemployment rate of 20%. Which is far higher than the city average. And we could say, well, in Auburn Gresham, the unemployment rate for Black women is 22%, right? we've been able to successfully integrate, 65 women into the workforce, and thereby kind of contributing to what it means to have stable employment. How do you locate what you're learning within the context of a larger community, within a larger question, within a larger within a broader question about need, right, that could be emerging in the community that you're serving? So interpretation, I guess, is part of understanding what the actual impact is that you're trying to measure or report out.
That's so rich. Thank you, Dr. Jackson. That is incredibly rich. And for our participants, I understand there are probably questions or thoughts that are arising for you. Please hold on to those. We will have an opportunity for Q&A toward the end of the presentation. Okay. And so I wanted to go ahead and think about some methods of evaluation, right? So these are not necessarily exhaustive, but these are kinds of buckets, again, from Gary Pearson's work in nonprofit. These are kinds of bucket suggestions that we might think about evaluative processes, okay? So in my experience in public health, the more common types tend to be impact evaluation. And Dr. Jackson spent quite a bit of time talking about that and giving examples of that, and performance evaluation. Now, Dr. Johnson, I know you have expertise in research partnership and facilitation. Could I get your input in terms of how this particular nonprofit worker has organized evaluation types in these particular categories?
Sure, thank you. So I appreciate all of these different categories. I think that they're very important. I think it can feel a little overwhelming in the sense that each one of these things is each one of these questions, where you're thinking about it, perhaps a group could usefully prioritize what the most important one would be for them. I think going back to what Dr. Jackson was saying, I do think of it as a cycle as well, so that you will, as you're going through a project, you may need a different type of evaluation at different times. So the who, what, why, and when question is always going on, and that might be part of your theory of change, is that you've got in mind something that you want to have at the end. Now, if I was an organization who was really focused on growth and capacity building, I would focus on formative evaluation, and that would be, in my mind, I sometimes use the word process evaluation. So that would be about stopping sort of at 3 months, 6 months, 12 months. Yeah, there'll be a regular sort of stopping and looking at where we are in a particular moment in time, and then look back in order to look forward. So you're doing a bit of reflection, you're looking at sort of how the organization itself can grow, what it needs, what resources it needs, what audience, what stakeholders it's looking to engage. So, for example, if you've had a difficult time recruiting, which can be the case, that would be an opportunity to just sit down, reflect on why, the reasons for that. And if part of you can then adjust, and you can sort of change, and you can sort of put in place steps which might address that problem. You might have the other problem of basically being over successful in recruiting. You're going to have the same issues, really. You're going to have to sort of think, oh, we can't actually, for example, train everybody on a program. We're going to have some criteria for engagement, or maybe we need to have the program offering 3 or 4 times. So there are moments. Evaluation is very useful in deciding to maybe have a pause, but also thinking about where you are in the journey. Impact is interesting because I think, as one of the people on the call mentioned at the beginning, they've done a pre and a post of some learners. So obviously that's really crucial. I think that's about impact on the individuals, and I wouldn't want who are taking the programs. And in my experience working with a lot of agencies and sort of thinking this through, you can get very hung up on the organizational processes and the evaluation of what's working or what's not, and the learner's experience it's hard because you've obviously got to keep them engaged as well throughout. So that's really important. In my mind, impact is very important. And if you are wanting to get funding in the future, you'll need the key here is to collect the evidence of who has been impacted by what you're doing. So there's the different levels of data and evidence which are used. There are some levels where it's useful for you as an organization. There's some levels where obviously it's useful to know how people have experienced it, but then there's also thinking beyond in terms of what evidence do I need in order to persuade another group to do what I have just done. So yes, I appreciate there are lots of different types of evaluation. You may not need all of them, but again, it goes back to thinking through right from the beginning, what type of evidence are you going to need, when and where, for whom?
Absolutely. And excuse me, everyone, I had muted myself because there's some noise in the background. So I hope that this doesn't disturb the flow of the kind of panel too much. And if it does, please let me know and I'll try to relocate to a different place in the apartment. But before we continue, I just wanted to welcome some new joiners to the group. So we have Mariam, and please correct me if I've mispronounced your name, and Miranda, who's joining us today as well. So a little bit of context, we've talked about Healthy Communities Coalition, we've talked about our featured guests and where their respective expertise is coming from. We've talked a little bit about research as one kind of process, and now we're getting more into evaluation as its own kind of process. So just to give you a kind of quick recap as far as where the conversation has gone so far. Okay.
I'm sorry, Gerpha, can you go back to the last slide for a moment?
Sure.
I'd like to piggyback on Dr. Johnson's comment. It's actually a question. I'm not piggybacking, but a couple of weeks ago, Dr. Johnson invited me to join a meeting with Pastors for Peace Corps, and there were stakeholders there. And it was really such an engaging experience. They were all community partners who had gone through this research project in partnership with Dr. Paris Davis and Dr. Johnson and others. And they completed the intervention. And Dr. Johnson, please correct me, but they completed the intervention. However, Dr. Johnson walked us through creating a research agenda to recommend. So is that correct, Dr. Johnson? And if it is, where would that fall? And does it fall in one of these evaluation types?
Yeah, that's a great question, Ede. So it does, because it was a learn by doing process. It was helping, initiative or program. So the members of the group were learning some techniques in order to manage, self-manage feeling about everyday trauma. So there was a development element there. But there was also a summative element, because they were on a journey. So having had the confidence to talk about the trauma and have the techniques to self-manage their feeling about it, the outcome was then to engage in, which things are emerging that you would like a research body to find more about, and just help have bigger understanding of. So it was, in that sense, that was the summative bit, because that was after the training had been completed. It was summing up the insights and achievements. And our next step going forward is to inform a wider public, a wider range of stakeholders about the value of that training program that we went through. In the process of people going through that program, what was so valuable was that they were highlighting the risk factors and the protective factors, their everyday experience of risk factors and protective factors. So we could summarize what those were for a wider audience as well. And so it came through the journey. So the journey of being involved in the program delivered the research agenda for in this particular case, a funder, Pecori, who was interested in that. But obviously, in that sense, the funder is becoming a bit of a funnel, because they're determining what the goals are. And of course, there was so much more that the people who had been involved themselves had gained, the organization had learned about capacity building. So, but that's how the agenda works within this framework. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, it was just so empowering. It was empowering for community partners to define based on what they knew. I mean, after all, the community partners are the ones who I think best understand our target populations. and are able to talk about the challenges, as opposed to, a researcher just maybe simply gleaning some data and statistics about that neighborhood. So it gives us an opportunity to actually define the agenda, and then find good partners and keep moving. Great, thank you.
And so just as a reminder for Miriam and Miranda, or a kind of notice, it was announced earlier in the panel that this is being recorded. And I also did let participants know that we will have some time toward the end for Q&A or some general group reflection. So I'll ask that you please hold any questions you have until the end of the presentation. So then we talk a lot about this in Healthy Communities Coalition, about connecting the dots and making all the different pieces of the pillars that we've talked about earlier make sense. And so Ede said in the very beginning of the panel, kind of rightfully so, that we are, or you all are, excuse me, in many ways as community-based organizations and faith-based organizations already doing research. And so this graphic shows, for example, the different ways that you might already be using metrics of program evaluation. Ede, is there any particular kind of bubble here that you'd like to speak to? And then I'll also ask Dr. Jackson for her input here as well.
I guess I'll speak to the importance of pilot projects. So actually, prior to the development of this series, we conducted a pilot project, Project Erase, where we surveyed 11 community organizations on the south side of Chicago, and we wanted to assess their interaction and their impression about research and research partnerships. And what we learned, we also asked questions about, about who they serve, about what type of data they're collecting. And it affirmed our belief that community partners are already, of course, impacting those social determinants of health. It let us know that 36%, I'm trying to recall the exact numbers, 36% of those organizations had never been engaged in an academic community partnership and were unfamiliar with any of the research terms we introduced. And that 60%, which is more than half of those organizations who responded to the survey, were primarily familiar with the research terms survey and focus groups. And so that really, it gave us grounding information to put together this series and open up the forum to have transparent community-hosted discussions as to how can we best learn, how can we connect, and how can we eventually become equitable partners in research partnerships and drive our own research. So I love pilot projects.
Yeah, yeah. Excuse me, Mariam. Thank you. Dr. Jackson, is there a particular bubble here? And I know that not every bubble will be relevant to community-based organization like CTR studies, but I'm wondering if there's a particular metric here that is speaking out to you, again, in your experience as an evaluator.
Yeah, I think all of these are kind of robust measures or indicators. They're part of the information gathering process, right? So that's central to evaluation. And I also want to take a pause here, and if we can, kind of disaggregate what we mean by evaluation and what we mean by data, because I think that they're two different things. So all of these things can both represent data and evaluation simultaneously, or they can be discrete, right? So administrative data is data, but it doesn't necessarily have to be evaluation, right? Service utilization can include data that, of course, looks at service utilization, but it's not necessarily in and of itself an evaluation. So really trying to understand our intentions of looking at, again, kind of like that life cycle of what it means to do evaluation, which starts with data collection or identifying data, identifying what data actually exists to answer the questions you have, what data you need to answer the questions you have, and then how do you gather that data? So that's kind of like the first step, right, in any evaluation process. So all these both kind of represent the kinds of data that can be used to answer evaluation questions, and they're robust sources of data. But then it's also like, well, what question do we want to use in service of this data? So if it's a service utilization evaluation, for example, it could be that the evaluation question is, how does X support Y, whatever those X and Y's are. So how does education and training for returning citizens impact their employment opportunities? And you have service utilization that you can say, well, we had X number of returning citizens access this particular service over the course of 2 years. And then you can use that data to help you answer that particular evaluation question. So just wanted to make sure that in our kind of conversations about talking about the robustness of each of these as opportunities to engage program evaluation, setting apart the differences between understanding what it means to collect and gather data, and then to use those as part of the tools and resources and activities that we have to answer a very, very specific evaluation question or two.
Thank you for that distinction, Dr. Jackson. And Ede, it seems like you've made an announcement in the chat.
Yes, I have, and they will see it in the chat. Thank you. They'll see it. I just wanted to sort of highlight and piggyback on what Dr. Jackson was saying, just to mark the calendars, because next month we're talking specifically about data.
Okay, thank you, Ede.
Awesome. Good conversation.
So as you can probably tell, I'm a big fan of using graphic organizers as a way of kind of presenting information. And so this is from that same University of Iowa Clinical and Translational Research Institute. And so one of the things that I really appreciate about using all these different graphics from these different places, the nonprofit, this clinical and translational center, is to show you that, again, to my earlier point, research is something that we're all doing at the community level, at the grassroots level, at the clinical level. One of the things that I will highlight from this particular graphic is that in community-based research, right, in research that is geared towards engaging the community across all stages of research, right, and all stages of quality improvement, for example, it begins with the community. The term that they're using here is stakeholder, right? Formerly, this might have been known as research participants. And it also loops back. If you'll notice, that bottom arrow is looping back to reporting the findings to the community members, right? So it's not a matter of just kind of subjectifying community members as research participants, studying them, collecting data based off of them, and then going away with that data to the ivory tower that Dr. Johnson was talking about. But it really is about incorporating them in the research process to the fullest extent, and including them as thought partners when it comes to data analysis, dissemination of results, overall program development, and continued evaluation. Okay, so that's one thing I want to kind of uplift from this graphic, right? There's another graphic that I like here that I think, similar to the evaluation outcome impact graphic, this one I think helps make evaluation maybe more, if not accessible, but maybe the importance of this more explicit to community-based and faith-based organizations. Again, so to Ede's point earlier, you may not necessarily think that you're using research principles, but you are. And these are kind of 4 general buckets, right, that evaluation and research impact assessment can be helpful in when it comes to saying, hey, how can research help me move my organizational mission along, right? Whether it comes to being accountable to my community members, accountable to funders, accountable to general society, right? When it comes to thinking about the allocation of research funds, funds, right? And those precious dollars and what we're doing with these funds, what priorities are we funding, right? When it comes to our mission and our agendas. When it comes to advocacy, right? And making the case for the need for continued research that continues to engage and uplift community voices, right? That prioritizes what the community feels is of importance when it comes to research, right? So that we can continue to fund things that matter to the community, right? And also analysis, right? How we're understanding the science of these processes of research, of data collection, and of evaluation. And so I'll stop here for a moment and see if either of our featured guests have anything that they want to kind of highlight about any of these bubbles. And notice this is all kind of a general kind of overlapping Venn diagram, right? So all of these bubbles share a relationship with one another. But I'll pause right here.
So I can talk a little bit to advocacy, I think, because I think making a case for research investments and funding is a very powerful reason for evaluation if you to continue the good work that one is doing. But there be perhaps sometimes a note of caution with this one, is that I feel, in my experience, I have community organizations, people like having conversations, they like have listening sessions, they like sharing. So that leads it to more qualitative methods. So you're talking about groups, you're talking about group conversations. And the richness of those group conversations is awesome. And I learn so much when I'm listening and I'm observing. It is much easier to advocate for with quantitative data, with survey data. And when I have gone into other environments, policy environments, and I have shared people's experiences, I often get asked, "Where's your quants? Where's your statistical data?" And I think so. As I hear Ede very much, and I hear what people have said in the survey, that surveys are the most commonly used, and that is one reason why it makes it easier to present a simple case, unfortunately, whereas the complexity of experience is much harder to present. And so making a case for research investments, future funding, must be based, I think, on multiple methods and multiple interpretations and complexity. But that's a tension I think is hard sometimes to juggle.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. And so I'm going to take a moment here and pause because, again, I want to be mindful of people's time. So my clock says we have about 11 minutes till the hour, all right? So Ede, I'm just going to ask out loud for the remaining slides, especially since this is being recorded. Welcome, Charles, to the conversation. Especially since this is being recorded, I'm wondering if you are okay if we kind of move through the remaining slides at a somewhat quicker pace so that our community participants have an opportunity to ask any questions or pose any reflections to our featured guests while we have them here together. Is that okay with you?
Great.
Yes, it's fine. How many more slides do we have?
Let me see. We have.
Oh, we're here. That's perfect.
There's
We're here,
one.
right?
There's one more
Okay.
that I wanted to talk about, and I
Okay.
don't know if it necessarily made it into a slide, but I wanted to talk about normative questions that people may find in research
Okay.
and descriptive research. And again, this is just kind of coming from my public health background, but I wanted to share that insight with you all here. So there are different kinds of research questions that we might have, right? So when it comes to thinking about descriptive and normative research questions, for context, this comes out of philosophy, right? The reason why I wanted to bring this to our conversation here about CBOs and FBOs is that depending on the work that you're doing, and Dr. Johnson already alluded to this, right? Your research questions will inform your respective programs that may differ from what another CBO or FBO is doing, right? So for instance, An example of descriptive research might be you sending out a survey as a kind of measurement tool, right? You're looking to answer a what question. You're trying to get input on something, right? Analysis of that survey data, or maybe coupling it with another kind of method, like a focus group, would help you answer the why and how. But for other organizations, maybe they want to do something more normative, right? And that usually involves testing out a hypothesis or an established theory or a particular method. And so a common example of this, not exclusively, but a common example of this is an experimentation, where you have a control and test group and a hypothesis that you're evaluating. So I say all that to say that we've talked a lot about research, both last month and this month, and we've shifted the conversation to thinking about another process, evaluation. But know that research and evaluation will look different depending on the work that you are respectively doing within your particular CBO or FBO. So I wanted to just share that as a kind of reassurance, right? You ultimately determine what your research looks like, right? And how you're leveraging that research to better serve your community members and respective populations. So I'll stop there. Let me note that there's an additional comment in the chat here. Thank you, Edie, for clarifying the language. I was using acronyms: CBO, community-based organization, FBO, faith-based organization. Okay. But I will go ahead and stop here and see if our community member participants have any questions for our featured guests. And you can feel free to either raise your hand or unmute yourself. That's totally fine. And I'll mute myself now.
Wow, there are no questions yet? Wow, I think, so were we that thorough? Excuse me. Wonderful. Thank you so much for spending your time with us. As Gerpha said, we do want to remain mindful of everyone's time. And so maybe we'll give it another minute or another 30 seconds, Gerpha, and then we can proceed with wrapping up. And any last minute closing remarks from our featured guests?
Okay. Okay. And as a reminder, oh, excuse me, Sherry, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I actually was going to just thank you all for this. I got this email and I'm like, oh, wow, I need to get on this because I am a new executive director at a new program, right? I'm doing homeless services on the south side of Chicago. And, you know, it always occurs for me that I need to collect some data to see what our impact is. But today was just really, it actually solidified that for me. And now I get an opportunity, I'm gonna go back and play it again to see what type of data I need to collect or what methodology I need to use to be able to collect the data. But this was quite interesting just to learn about the differences of the collecting the data and evaluating the process, right? And the distinctions between the two. So I learned a lot and I'm quite proud of myself today. So thank you for the opportunity. Yes.
Awesome. Thank you, Sherry. And thank you to our featured guests for being able to share your wonderful and rich insight. It is already, as you can see, making an impact. Okay. So as part of our wrap up, we wanted to thank you for joining us. For those who joined us later in the panel, I shared this QR code earlier. This is a QR code, or I shared a separate QR code earlier linking to the Project Erase survey profile that is also linked on the Healthy Communities Coalition website. This will be a QR code that takes you to an evaluation, right? And so we'd love for you to go ahead and give us feedback. We're kind of modeling the techniques that we've talked about throughout our community conversation series and collecting data based on how you feel these community conversations are going and how helpful you think they are. So we'd love for you to go ahead and help us collect some data, all right? And as a reminder, this is going to be, this is being recorded. And I understand that Ede is going to think about how to share this information as a resource to all of those who participated here today and beyond, especially those who weren't able to make it for the first half of the session. So I want to go ahead and turn it back to our featured guests, thank them again for their time, and just offer maybe a space for any final kinds of reflections or thoughts from our featured guests, Dr. Rebecca Johnson and Dr. Crystal Jackson.
So I think my final thing would be, don't be frightened by evaluation. I think evaluation is absolutely, it can be really enjoyable. I think it helps everybody understand how people are experiencing the wonderful programs that you're putting together and that you're doing, and it also helps. I think it just is that often you get that aha moment. So you're observing people, you're thinking about it, you're finding out about how people have experienced something that you often feel passionately about because you put it together, a program that you put together. But just go with it and find out how people are experiencing your programs, and don't put it off to the end. Think about what you want to get out of a program from the beginning. I think that's really important, because it can tend to feel a little bit onerous. Oh, I've got the evaluation to do. But actually, in the end, it's really the most beautiful thing, because you're finding out about how people are experiencing what you have cared enough to put on.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson.
Yeah, I love that. I think what Dr. Johnson said is so important, and maybe I'll along the same thread, just say that evaluation at the end of the day should be useful. So as you're planning your evaluation, don't think about like the idea that data is just going to sit on your desk, or going to go on a shelf after you collect it. That the idea is that this is going to be useful, that it's the utilization is going to hopefully help you as an organization. I love that slide that Gerpha shared earlier, that talked about advocacy and the use of various uses of data. And I think at the end of the day, what we want evaluation and data to do is to help us make decisions and to help contribute to what we know about communities. So if you're doing both of those things, then you're doing it precisely right.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Jackson. And I'll turn it back to you, Ede. It seems like there's some comments in the chat.
Now, this is great. Thank you all for joining us today. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Walton. Thank you, Professor Miranda. Thank you. I saw Ticey earlier. Thank you all. I don't want to get into calling names because soon we'll have about 50 or 100 people in this room, right? So I'm really happy that this has just proven helpful. Next month, please mark your calendars, June 20th, where we're talking specifically about research and data use, data collection, and data analysis. You can reach us online, healthycc.us. You can register for next month's events as well. We'll also have different events there as well. So please bookmark us, like us on LinkedIn and Facebook. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, everyone, for joining. Bye-bye now.
Oh, yes. Thank you, Professor Miranda. Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye. I will start recording, I think. Let's see. Thank you, Gerpha. We will talk soon.
Okay, that sounds great. Okay.
Okay.
Stop sharing. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.